beginning, and here's a series of things, and I'll just lay them out and then talk about them to the depth that I can at this point, Madam Speaker. ACORN's involvement early on, way back in the Community Reinvestment Act. This Congress passed the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977 and then refreshed it under Bill Clinton in the 90s. Community Reinvestment Act recognized something that was wrong, and that was that we had lenders who looked at neighborhoods and concluded that the real estate value in those neighborhoods was declining because of violence, because of activities going on in those neighborhoods. And so they drew what they called redlining. They drew a red line around those neighborhoods and concluded that they weren't going to loan money for homes or real estate in those neighborhoods because the value of the real estate was going down. If you looked at the racial makeup of the residents of those red-lined areas, often it was African Americans in those inner city parts. Some of them contributed to the decline in the value of the real estate. Some of them were victims of the decline in value of the real estate. The Community Reinvestment Act was passed to encourage lenders to, let me just say it in simplistic terms, make bad loans in bad neighborhoods, to loan into the red line neighborhoods so that they could improve the percentage of home ownership, get more people into their own homes, and the theory is they will take care of them, they'll have a nest egg to work with, and they'll be more stable with everything that they do. The families will be more stable too. I don't disagree with the philosophy that passed the Community Reinvestment Act. I disagree with the result of what came about. And what came about was ACORN seizing on the Community Reinvestment Act and learning that they could go in and essentially intimidate lenders. If lenders wanted to expand or open up a branch office, they had to meet the standards of the Community Reinvestment Act, vaguely written. But those standards were easier to prove if you had the approval of ACORN. If you had the disapproval of ACORN, it was hard to get them approved because ACORN established political connections and supported political candidates and became a get-out-the-vote machine for Democrats. Now, think in terms of Chicago politics. I think Chicago is the city in America that best illustrates the foundation that is ACORN. And so ACORN intimidated lenders. They went up into, they got groups together. Some would say gangs. I'm calling them groups. And they went into lenders' offices and sometimes shoved the banker's desk over to the wall and surrounded him and hollered at him and screamed at him and intimidated the lender into making bad loans in bad neighborhoods. They intimidated lenders and banking institutions to write nice big checks to ACORN, and then ACORN used that money to operate. And if they wrote a big enough check, ACORN wouldn't be in there demonstrating or jamming the entryways to the banks and shutting down their commerce. These were intimidation, shakedown tactics. ACORN is just one of the entities that did that. We know of a few others, and I think the name Jesse Jackson comes to mind for most people when I raise this subject matter. There were other entities out there that did the same thing. But ACORN was in the center of this, and not only that, but ACORN found themselves in a situation where they could go out and identify and broker the people who would qualify for these low-interest loans, subprime loans. A lot of subprime loans were promoted by ACORN. The lending institutions made those loans because then ACORN would be off of their back and allow their doors to stay open, and they kept this relationship going. ACORN also found themselves in a position to be brokering these subprime loans through into the secondary market of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So I think already, Madam Speaker, you see the pattern here. Community Reinvestment Act was a foundation that allowed ACORN to go in and intimidate lenders and set themselves up where they became the broker for home mortgage loans that many times were subprime loans that were sold on the secondary market to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and on up through the line to the investment banks where these loans were sliced, diced, sorted, shuffled, cut, stacked, and tranched. And all of that went on to the point where you couldn't trace where all the loans had gone anymore, but the collateral still was attached to the mortgage loans. And this became part of the core of the financial meltdown that we've experienced in the last several months. That's transgression number one for ACORN. Transgression number two is ACORN's pledge to go out and register, I think their goal was 1.3 million new voters for the 2008 election cycle. So they put their minions out into the streets across America. interesting. I mean, they'd been active doing this before. There were investigations that came up in 2006. 2006 election in the state of Washington, ACORN turned in on one sample 1,800 voter registration forms, and the number of legitimate registration forms out of 1,800 was 6. Only 6 were real. The rest were phony. I didn't do the percentage on that, but I can tell you it's not very good. And so they brought about a prosecution there and got some kind of settlement. But that was 2006. There were other incidents scattered across the country. The focus of these incidents seemed to show up in swing states like Ohio, states that they wanted to affect the result of the election. Of about 5 or 6 important swing states, ACORN was the most active in them. Now, this is also an organization that has received, as a matter of fact, more than $53 million of our tax dollars to fund them. To do what? Well, in part, facilitate bad loans in bad neighborhoods sold up through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which have since been nationalized, by the way, because of the insolvency in part created by some of those transactions. And a get-out-the-vote Democrat drive that took place in many of the cities, Chicago, for example, and register hundreds of thousands of fraudulent voter registrations. And in fact, by ACORN's own admission, over 400,000 fraudulent registrations were filed by ACORN in that cycle leading up to the 2008 election. And I asked for investigations. I asked for congressional inquiries. I asked for the Justice Department to look into ACORN. And I have no sympathy on this side of the aisle. I temporarily had some sympathy from the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Conyers, who for about 3 weeks was on record as believing that there was evidence there that may warrant that we take it up and investigate ACORN. But 3 weeks after he expressed the sentiment, he concluded that there wasn't enough evidence there. There's a lawsuit against ACORN that has been won and a settlement that's been achieved. We have put hundreds of pages of data into the records here in this Congress, and still they conclude that there's not enough evidence there to bear looking into it. We've named hundreds of, well, I don't know if it's hundreds, we've named dozens of post offices this year. We debate these on the floor under suspension, we vote and name post offices. We've got time to name post offices, but we don't have time to look into ACORN, which is corrupting our election process and has undermined the financial integrity of the United States of America. And furthermore, Madam Speaker, we have to suspect that there's a real lack of enthusiasm on the part of the administration as well as the Democrats in the Congress, in the House, and in the Senate. Because when we look back through the history of the President of the United States, we find a consistent association with ACORN on the part of Barack Obama. Barack Obama, who was a lawyer for ACORN and argued for them in a motor voter registration case, albeit pro bono, but still their employee, still representing ACORN in court. And when someone does that pro bono, does that tell you they agree with them or disagree with the agenda of ACORN? I think we all can agree that if you're going to take a case for free and argue in court, that surely you must agree with the principles and the people that you're working for. You're not going to see me go represent Planned Parenthood in court for free, or for a check for that matter, because I disagree with the agenda of Planned Parenthood. Barack Obama clearly agreed with the agenda of ACORN. He worked for them for free and represented them in court. That makes him their employee as their attorney. Now, if that's not compelling enough, Madam Speaker, we'll take another component of this. Barack Obama headed up Project Vote. Project Vote is a subsidiary of ACORN. That's not disputed. They're the get-out-the-vote machine in Chicago. That's not disputed. The head of ACORN in Chicago hired President, well, that time, Barack Obama, to train the people that were going to work under Project Vote to get out the vote, and also those that would go into the bankers' offices and encourage them to make bad loans in bad neighborhoods. Part of this enterprise that has all of the trappings of a criminal enterprise, headed up in Chicago by